Albert Einstein said, "The important thing is not to stop questioning." Today, we explore one of humanity's oldest questions. Why do we age and why do we die? We have a Nobel Laureate scientist, together with a neuroscientist, take us to the frontier of biology and the brain, into cells that divide, systems that fail, and the evolutionary reasons our lives are finite. Their conversation, inspired by the new book, Why We Die, invites us to look at mortality not with fear, but with clarity, reminding us that understanding death may be the most profound way to understand life. Let's welcome our main speaker today. From studying biology in India to pioneering molecular research in the US and UK, he has transformed our understanding of one of life's greatest mysteries: how our cells build proteins, the very machinery that keeps us alive. His groundbreaking work on the ribosome earned him the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and today he brings that same clarity and curiosity to his best-selling books, inviting us to explore not just the science of life, but the meaning behind it. Please put your hands together now for Dr. Venki Ramakrishnan. In conversation with Dr. Ramakrishnan is a senior professor and chair of the Department of Biological Sciences at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai, a neuroscientist trained at Yale, the Karolinska Institute, and Oxford. Her pioneering research focuses on how the brain processes emotion, how life experiences shape those circuits, and the role of psychedelics in reshaping the brain. Please put your hands together for Vidita Vaidya.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. What an honor this is, Venki. Thank you so much.
Not at all.
All right. In the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to go into a deep dive with one of the leading thinkers of our time and leading biologists of our time, exploring the question of why we die. Let's kickstart the conversation then by first defining what you mean by the term death, by the term aging and senescence, and the relationship between these terms that are so often conflated with each other.
Right. So death is a very peculiar concept, and there are many types of death. And what we mean by death is the death of us as an individual. But there's a paradox. When you're alive, millions of cells in you are dying all the time, and you don't even notice it. But the other side of the coin is, at the moment of your death, most of the cells in your body are still alive. In fact, entire organs are alive, and that's why you can donate them. If you die in a car accident, for example, you could donate your organs to a recipient. So what does it mean? It means the inability to function as a whole individual, as a coherent individual. And that has something to do with our ability to keep our body going as a unit. So then you asked about aging. Well, aging is what leads to death. Aging is the gradual loss of function as a result of damage and changes inside us. Now, these changes and damage can occur at many different levels. They can occur fundamentally at the level of our molecules, but then they can also manifest themselves in damage to higher entities, like organelles inside our cells, like our mitochondria, or cells, or tissues. So you can have aging at many different levels. And where aging leads to death is if you have the loss of a critical system. So, systems engineers will recognize that as a critical system failure. So if you lose your arm, you're not going to die. You'll just be, you just won't have an arm. But if your heart stops working, or your brain stops working, or your kidneys stop working, then your body can't function, and then you die. So it's a loss of a critical system. Now, senescence is a peculiar state, which, we may come to it later, but I might as well tell you about it. When cells undergo stress of various kinds, for example, if cells get their DNA damaged, beyond a certain state when they can't repair the damage, the cells sense a stress and they have two choices. One is to commit suicide, that's one pathway. Another is to go into a state called senescence where they no longer function normally. They don't divide, but at the same time they secrete inflammatory molecules which are a signal to the immune system to come and clear the senescent cells away and maybe repair the site around it. Now this suggests that senescence is always a bad thing. It's a response to something that went wrong. But it turns out senescent cells exist even in embryonic development. When the embryo is developing, the senescent cells form, and they're actually required for proper development, much the same way that certain cells have to die during development for proper development to occur. So these are surprising things that have only come out in the last 30 or 40 years. And so senescence is a peculiar response to damage or aging.
These three words, senescence, aging, death, which sort of interweave between each other and have a profound relationship. Also in the context of the point you made, which is that it is when the coherent whole goes, that's when you have death. But what about interesting species on this planet? And since we have to come back to Dobzhansky, and nothing in biology makes sense in the absence of looking at it through the lens of evolution.
Yeah.
If you think about planaria and hydra and immortal jellyfish, or even you look at newts and salamanders, and the ability to bring back the coherent, well, not the full coherent whole, but in many cases,
yeah.
How would you define death when you have species that are sort of testing that?
So they're a little bit like plants. Plants can regenerate. If we lose an arm, we can't regenerate it. But if you cut off the arm of a starfish, it will regenerate the arm. But, so hydra and the immortal jellyfish are a bit like that. And what it does is it requires regenerative stem cells distributed throughout the body so that as tissue wears out, they can constantly regenerate new tissue. So it looks as though they're immortal, but they also said, like some of these very long-lived species, there's the giant tortoise called the Galapagos tortoise. People claimed for some time that it too was biologically immortal. And others claimed that an ugly rodent called the naked mole rat, which lives for about 30 years, which is quite impressive for a small animal, was also biologically immortal. But it turns out if you actually observe a single naked mole rat as it gets older, it has all of the symptoms of old age: bad skin, bad hair, poor eyesight, slow movement, probably lower cognition. So all of those things happen even to the naked mole rat. And my suspicion is that even if you looked at the immortal jellyfish or the hydra, these normally don't age in the wild because they die of other reasons. They get eaten or they just die of other causes before they age. But if you were to protect it and watch it over time, you would find that it too will age and die. And in fact, even a single tree has a lifespan. It's not immortal. It can be hundreds of years, but or thousands in the case of some yew trees. But they too, eventually will die.
Let's bring it back to our species. We tend to be most interested in ourselves, and so our death is what tends to fundamentally obsess us. Is it true to say that it is literally perhaps only our species that has this unique ability, in a sense, to be aware of the certainty and inevitability of our own deaths?
Nobody can say for sure because we don't know, the language of dolphins or other species, but there's no evidence that other species are aware of mortality. They may be aware of death. For example, elephants are known to mourn when one of their herd has died. They know where that animal has died and they sort of remember it. But there's no evidence that a young elephant knows that its mother and father are going to die, at 80 years of age, and it too will die one day. But we discover that, and the reason we discover that is because of the evolution of language. And so we have, because of language, we've been able to make generalizations, and we have been able to communicate general ideas. And that has really resulted in driving human culture. A lot of human culture is driven by this fear of mortality. In fact, if you look at all religions are essentially, ways of thinking of death as a transition rather than an end. For example, the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they believe that the body itself will resurrect one day, on Judgment Day, the whole body. And so they insist that the body has to be buried. They're very much, traditionally, they were against cremation. And, Eastern religions, on the other hand, say, well, maybe the body dies, but there's some immortal essence that will then occupy some new body, in reincarnation. So you can see how, and the Egyptians, they would bury their pharaohs in these elaborate tombs because they felt that the pharaoh would come alive, and then, if the pharaoh was a good man, he would go to paradise, and, a particular kind of paradise. So all cultures everywhere have had this way of coping with death and that knowledge of death.
We're at a literature fest, and fiction is literally one of the other things that must have co-evolved. So just going back to the idea that somewhere, some point in hominid evolution, one of our ancestors had this momentary awareness that once, so as you said, other species are aware of the conceptual idea of death.
Yeah.
They may even mourn.
Maybe it happened gradually.
Yeah, and if that's true, then given the existential angst and emerging dread that comes with the possibility that one is limited and transient, do you have to also co-evolve a way of coping so that you can tell yourself that despite the fact that you know that death is inevitable, you can also live with the fiction for yourself that you are in principle immortal?
Yeah,
and are those...
we all behave as if we're immortal. For example, I'm still making plans for 2 years from now. So I'm assuming, I'm 73 years old. I'm assuming I'm going to still be around and, going to this event, 2 years from now. So we don't act in our lives as if we're going to die. The only time that happens is if you're really, faced with some terminal event. If your doctor says you have 2 months to live, then that really focuses your mind, and you have to come to grips with your mortality. But otherwise, in the normal scheme of things, you just don't worry about it. I think that's an evolutionary. You're a neuroscientist, so you probably know more than I do about this. But I would imagine that we've evolved with some sort of coping mechanism, so we don't constantly brood about it.
So let's delve a little bit further and come up with some additional terms that we should define before we get further into this conversation. In the last 150 years or so, we've doubled life expectancy, or even perhaps a little bit more than that. And we've, the question of how long are we going to live, what's our lifespan? And now you hear this word much more often, and a lot of people talk about health span. So if you could tell us what does doubling lifespan even mean and refer to? And
so there's there are several concepts here. There's lifespan, which is a sort of loose term, which roughly means life expectancy at birth. What this means is how long probabilistically can you hope to live, when you're born, so that, you have a 50% chance of reaching a particular age, okay? And that has changed from, less than 40 years to more than 80 years in developed countries. And I think India is actually pretty close to that now. So you could imagine that over 150 years, we've doubled our life expectancy at birth. However, it has not changed our maximum lifespan, which is how long could you hope to live if you avoided all the problems? You didn't get some horrible infectious disease, you didn't have an accident, you didn't get murdered, and you didn't get cancer or heart attacks or any of those things. How long could you hope to live? Now, that may not have changed because, Michelangelo in the 1500s lived to be 89 years old, okay, when life expectancy was under 40. So there's a difference between maximum lifespan, which is, the limit of the species, and average life expectancy at birth. Now, average life expectancy at birth increased not because they extended the limit to which we could live by slowing down aging and things. Rather, it was a number of things. One was better sanitation. That was one of the biggest things. Clean water and separating sewage from drinking water. That was a huge increase in lifespan. A second was vaccination, and the third was fertilizers, oddly enough, which really meant that you were not living close to the edge of starvation, that most of the population wasn't living close to the edge of starvation, which would make them prone to illnesses and infections and so on. So those were big advances, and those got us from 40 to, say, maybe the 60s. And then there were more advances in the last few decades on tackling heart attacks, diabetes, many types of cancer. And so that then pushed it further into the 70s and now into the 80s. Now, health span, you mentioned, is very hard to define. It's saying, how many years? Okay, if you're born today in a developed country, you can expect to live over 80 years, say 82 or 3. And by the way, there's a difference between men and women. But how many of those years can you expect to live healthily? And that's, of course, not the entire period. So typically, you can expect to live maybe 10 years less, in healthy life. So if your life expectancy is, say, 82, maybe your health span is about 72 or so. Now, but health span is a very hard concept. It's very easy to define lifespan because it's when you die. That's a very precise thing. But when you decide when somebody is not healthy, that's more difficult. And the standard definition is if somebody has 4 or more comorbidities. So comorbidity would be something like diabetes or, atherosclerosis or high blood pressure, or kidney disease, things like that. So those would be comorbidities. And if you're living with 4 or more, then you're considered, not healthy anymore.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea that if you just look at the population curve across the last 1,000 years and then something unreal happens in the last 150 years is a testimony certainly to biomedical science, sanitation, and public health. Yeah. But also, as you said, the Haber-Bosch process. So we had David Macmillan visit TIFR just literally a few days ago, a Nobel Laureate in chemistry, and he peppered his conversation with an anecdote where he said that 50% in this room, 50% of the people in this room, 50% of their nitrogen atoms actually come from a factory in Germany. I think he was perhaps exaggerating.
No, there's lots of nitrogen-fixing factories in India, so it's much more likely.
I think what he meant was the Haber-Bosch process changed something fundamentally in terms of fertilizers and availability of food and resource.
I wouldn't say it's 50% of people, it's 50% of atoms in everyone has been through a Haber-Bosch factory chamber.
Right.
50% of nitrogen atoms, not
nitrogen
the other.
atoms, right. Yeah. So one of the most lovely things about your book, besides the fact that it deals with some fairly meaty concepts that many of us, including scientists, but also lay people, are fundamentally interested in, is that it's peppered thoroughly with anecdotes. And you have this anecdote that captured my imagination, because you talk about a bet that happens in 2001 between these two scientists, and this bet is only going to be settled 150 years later. And I was wondering, because it's such an interesting anecdote, because most of us will not be around to see the end of that bet.
Neither will they.
Neither will they.
Yeah.
So I thought if you could just tell us, what is this bet in the biology of aging between...
So Stephen Ostad both of them are very well-known longevity scientists. So Stephen Ostad studies interesting species that have unusually long lifespans and in fact diverge. There's a rough power law, so the larger an animal, typically the longer it lives. So a mouse doesn't live as long as, say, an elephant, which doesn't live as long as a blue whale. So there's a rough correlation, and it follows roughly a power law. But there are animals that are off this curve, and so he's interested in why they are. And one interesting thing about it is that he was an English literature major. So here we are at the Lit Live Festival. He started off as an English literature major, and then he was a journalist for a while, and then for a brief period, he was involved in taming wild animals for Hollywood. So he was like a lion tamer, for these Hollywood movies and so on. So of course, he was interested in exotic animals. And then he became interested in longevity, and that's been his big thing. And he's written a really interesting book called Methuselah's Zoo. Methuselah, of course, was the biblical prophet who lived for 800 years or something. So this is a collection of long-lived species. Now, he was at a conference, and he said, somebody asked him, how long do you think we'll be able to live, as science progresses? And so in a moment, maybe he did it almost as a joke, I don't know, but he stands by it. He said, well, actually, the person who's going to live to be 150 has already been born, okay? So that was his bet, his saying. And so his friend, Jay Olshansky, who's a skeptic about extreme longevity, and he's a demographer, so he looks at trends in life expectancy and lifespan. So he made a bet. He said, you're wrong. And so they said, okay, let's have a bet. And so the bet was $100. So each person would put in $100. And the idea was by the time they would collect it, they wouldn't be around. But if they invested it at 6% return, it would be worth, several million dollars. Of course, we don't know what $1 million would buy. Maybe it would buy you an ice cream or something. But anyway, that was their bet, okay? And then they decided that 10 years or further, they wanted to ask, are we still on? And they decided to double their bet, to make it because I think the initial calculation was something like half a million or something. Now it would be 1 million, so that was the...
So let me ask you, if you had to take sides on this argument, which side are you taking?
I think, so let me explain the premise. None of them believe that just by curing cancer or heart attacks, you're going to live to 150. In fact, Olshansky has done a calculation that if you eliminated the 4 big diseases of old age, which are diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and dementia, all of the dementias, if you eliminated all of them, you would gain about 15 years, which is not nothing. It means if you live to 85 now, you'd live to 100, okay? But beyond that would take really actually interfering with the aging process itself. And so I think their disagreement is not that it's impossible, but how quickly it'll happen. So I think Stephen Ostad is optimistic that within a few years or so, we'll already sort of be on the way to slowing down aging with many drugs, because there are drugs that, add 30% to the lifespan of mice. Of course, those drugs have some problems, but, that's what gives him his optimism.
That wasn't really an answer, but I'll take that, yeah. But coming back to the...
Oh, the answer is I'm on Olshansky's side. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, okay. I'm pushing you to get a response on that. We'll see 150 years down the road. Someone will hopefully have some recording of your comment, and then they'll deal with that then.
Well, mine's irrelevant, but the bet will remain.
Will remain, yeah. So, coming down to looking, I mean, this whole conceptual idea and the belief that you can reverse, slow down aging, you can interfere with the underlying biology happening in distinct organs and cells to modulate them and then slow down or reverse the process of aging and senescence, thus eventually driving organismal lifespan to expand and stretch. It's interesting because we're able to clone and have induced pluripotent stem cells, and you can start with a differentiated cell and can generate an organism from that. So there's been some serious rejigging of our ideas in the last 20 years from biology, but the conceptual, we're not anywhere near yet reversing or slowing down aging, though we understand some of the biology of it.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, once a cell gets old, can you ever possibly reverse it? And, we actually do it all the time in our lives. For example, every time that people have a child, the child is born at 0, but the child came out of cells from two adults, from the adult parents. Of course, those were particular cells called germ cells, and germ cells, it turns out, don't age as fast. They're very protected, but they do age, and that's why older couples, for example, have trouble having children. But what was shown by John Gurdon was that you could take the skin cell of a frog and take the nucleus out of that skin cell and put it into the egg of another frog, which had its nucleus removed, and then that nucleus, with this nucleus from the skin cell, would start developing into a new frog. And the resulting frog would not be a descendant of the egg, where the egg came from, but it would be a direct clone of the frog that donated the skin cell. And that means that the skin cell's DNA and the cell had obviously aged, could nevertheless go back and develop a completely new frog. Then this was repeated in mammals, called Dolly the sheep was a great example. But Dolly the sheep actually only lived to be about half as old as normal sheep. So people said, aha, it's because it came from an adult cell, and so it started life as an old sheep, even though it was newborn. But it turns out Dolly was an exception. There were other sheep that were cloned at that time, and those went on to live normal lives. And that means, you got almost an extra life from the skin cell of a sheep. So what this means is that in principle, to some extent, I mean, you couldn't do this indefinitely, but to some extent, you might be able to, reverse aging. And so the question is, can you do it systematically? And that was done by a scientist named Yamanaka, who showed that, this normal progression, you go from a fertilized egg to a few cells, to more cells, which form the embryo, to, sort of early embryo with organs forming, and then a fully grown baby, that's essentially a developed individual. That's used to be thought of a one-way traffic. Now, John Gurdon shows it's not necessarily true in principle, but Yamanaka showed that just by inserting 4 genes and turning them on into a fully developed cell, you could make that cell go backwards, almost to the fertilized egg. Not quite, but to the stage where that cell can become any of the tissues in the final body. Those are called pluripotent stem cells. So what this has given people an idea is that maybe, as we get older, our tissues constantly need to be replaced, and the stem cells that are regenerating our tissues are also aging, and they're getting fewer in number. What if we were to provide Yamanaka factors to our tissues and sort of make them go slightly backwards? Now, you wouldn't want them to go all the way back, because then, they would lose their identity. So a kidney cell would no longer remember that it was a kidney cell. It would become a pluripotent stem cell. So you'd only want it to go a little bit backwards. And to do that, they turned on these factors transiently. So they switched them on and they switched them off using some tricks. And, much to my surprise when I read these papers, the animals didn't live longer, but they looked healthier. These older animals resembled younger animals by many criteria. Okay, so this has led to many companies, including a very well-funded company called Altos Labs, put a lot of effort into what's called cellular reprogramming to try and reprogram our tissues.
Coming to that idea that it's a very exciting time, certainly in the broad biology and science space of aging, but it's also a time when we're seeing a variety of people get interested in it and emerge from, funders who are driving it, / a lot of people in Silicon Valley who would like to go to Mars and perhaps land, but not die at the moment of landing, but you have the whole spectrum.
He wants to die on Mars, but not on impact.
Not on impact, yeah. So you have this drive coming from, and largely a lot of funding coming from Silicon Valley, where people like to break things and remake them and continuously do this. But some of the stuff is slow by definition in terms of our understanding, and it's often back and forth. And the risk is that with concepts like antagonistic pleiotrophy, ideas where you might have a gene that does a great job in development, you now ectopically drive it in an aging system, you drive cancer, you tweak with telomeres. So how does one in this space handle the speed at which things are moving without having the caution to calmly look at results with a certain degree of objectivity and still dive into them sufficiently and explore those ideas?
Yeah, no, there are a number of ideas that are, more promising than others. You mentioned, there are many things, many of the biological processes that cause us to age had an evolutionary purpose. They may have prevented cancer early in life, or they may have helped us grow fast early in life, because biology does not care how long you live. The way evolution works is it selects for your genes, so it's selecting for your ability to pass on your genes. This is what evolutionary biologists call fitness. And so evolutionary fitness means the ability to pass on your genes. And so many pathways that optimized fitness really also cause you to die later in life, but evolution doesn't care. As long as you've passed on your genes, you're no longer relevant, to evolution. So the problem is that, for example, in worms, there was a mutation that doubled the lifespan of worms. Now, the problem with many of these mutations is, if you take those mutant worms and put them in a petri dish with, normal worms, then they're outcompeted within a couple of generations. So you can see they don't grow as fast, they're maybe not as vigorous early in life, and so they lose out to wild-type worms, which is why that mutation is not selected for in nature. It's only done in this artificial lab system. So what you're saying is quite right. Sometimes there's a fine balance, and there's always there's a penalty sometimes if you tinker with the system. But having said that, there are some pathways that seem more promising than others. And one of them is that experiments in many species have shown that if you calorically restrict them, that is, if you restrict the number of calories in their diet, so they're not starving, but they're getting the bare minimum that they need to be, survive indefinitely, then those animals resemble younger animals, and it also increases their lifespan, by 20 or 30%. And by the way, that's one of the reasons OSTAD is optimistic. So now, caloric restriction is very, very hard. And I can tell you, if a guy like me comes to India, it's even harder, okay? So, but there are drugs that will affect pathways that change as a result of caloric restriction in the same way, so they in effect mimic caloric restriction. So some of these drugs are now being actively investigated by longevity researchers. The problem is, some of these drugs are also, they're immunosuppressive drugs, and so they make you more prone to infection. Now, that's all right if you're working on sterile mice in sterile cages in a lab, but what about going out? You're not going to remain in a bubble. So then it becomes problematic. So people are trying to see if they can get the good effects without the bad side effects. So that's one example of
in your book, you very kindly refer to many of the people rushing into this field, both for financial gains and also perhaps because of interest, as immortality merchants. And I was thinking that was a very kind way of referring to perhaps sometimes plain old snake oil peddling, because that is also a huge component of this space.
Yeah. No, I do.
Currently.
I think one of my chapters is called Prophets or Crackpots, because most prophets in their lifetime, they were thought of as crackpots, okay? And they became prophets in hindsight. So, but the consequence is every crackpot thinks he or she is a prophet, and there were probably, for every real prophet, there were probably thousands of crackpots in any given era. So, I think that's a problem today,
It's a big problem, because between what we get on our phone, what we hear on WhatsApp forwards, and what one gets from partial or incompletely synthesized information, it's really hard for a layperson interested in potentially looking at their own lifespan to make sense of what's genuine, real, and reasonable and credible advice, and what is absolutely not true. So this becomes a challenge, and as a scientist who's taken picked up the idea of tackling misinformation and writing about it, is that something you think is going to be the call of the day for the scientific community long term?
I don't think the science community alone can do it. I think it needs, governments and regulations, some sort of guidelines and so on. But then the problem is, how do you ensure that you have guidelines and regulations without getting into censorship? So there's always this constant battle. That's a very difficult problem, I think.
Before we open it out to the audience, I want to come to one question which you end your book with, which is, should we be expanding lifespan at all? From a perspective of the ethical and moral implications as a species for ourselves, occupying this planet with many other co-inhabitants, and we've certainly contributed quite a bit to Anthropocene in terms of what we've done to our environment, and what does this open up?
So the one thing is that increasing lifespan is not necessarily going to increase population, okay? Because, for example, Japan or Korea or many European countries have dramatically increased their lifespan, even in the last 50 years, and their population is, if anything, has declined, okay? So there's no law that because you live longer, you're going to have a population explosion. But the flip side is, if you don't have a population explosion, what it means is that you'll have to have fewer and fewer children, or rather, your children will be spaced out further, but then you run into a natural limit of menopause, which we don't know how to change the onset of menopause. So, what you'll have is a society where you have fewer children being born. That's already an issue in Japan, Italy, Korea, etc. And by the way, India is now close to replacement rate, and South India is below replacement rate. So, it's happening everywhere. And so what you'll then have is an increasingly old society. And it is true that people accumulate power, influence, and wealth, which are all correlated, obviously. So they accumulate this with time. So as they get older, they're wealthier, they're more powerful, they're more networked, more influential. And so they will, be influencing society. This will lead to intergenerational fairness. Young people will, in the old days, you had to wait for a professor to die before, you could get a professorship, so, or retire anyway, right? So I think it'll lead to that sort of situation. And I also point out that, really big creative breakthroughs come about when the person is relatively young. And I used to think this was just science and mathematics, but Kazuo Ishiguro, the famous writer, pointed out it's also true for authors of fiction. Like Tolstoy wrote War and Peace in his 30s, and he points out a whole bunch of authors who did their best work, when they were sort of under 40. So, and it's possible that the reason we're creative isn't because we're biologically young, but rather we're seeing the world fresh for the first time when we're young. And we're more open-minded and open to new ideas, and that's what creativity involves. And as we get older, we accumulate, experience, but we also accumulate prejudices and dogma and so on. And so maybe we're not so creative.
Thank you so much, Venki. I have devoured this book and made notes on all the side pages. It's a profoundly interesting book because not only does it introduce you to all the concepts of what causes aging, but it humanizes the story of discovery because in each of those anecdotes are stories about the people who made the discovery. And I think one of the things I liked so much about it is the danger of science becoming the pulpit from which scientific priests now declare what is right or wrong, tends to again distance science from the large pool of the society in which we are deeply embedded. And I think by humanizing science and scientists with all their foibles, their misunderstandings, the possibility of getting it profoundly wrong, it's a story of humanity in a sense, and science is just a component of the way we explore our time on this planet. And so thank you so much for writing this absolutely fantastic book. I think we can open it up to questions. And we can take questions from the audience for Venki now. I think there's one right here in the fourth row.
This is Mahesh here, doing a lot of research on life and holistic health as an engineer. There's an age-old book written on human lifespan in Vedas. Have you ever come across that Bhrigu Samhita? And it talks about holistic living as well as various relation and karmic and cosmic connects of healthy living. There is a health also in the whole aspect.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a lot of things written in scriptures in all cultures, not just Indian, not just Hindu cultures. The problem is that unless you have a clear prescription that is testable, it's not science, okay? It's some observation or a claim, but it isn't science, okay? So there may be things there that are true, but if they're true, they need to be put to the test, in a proper controlled experiment. And that's where I would sort of differ from people who would just take it at face value.
There's a question here, Ravi.
Yeah, you talked about increasing the lifespan. Does it necessarily mean that the health span, as you defined, also would increase? And the second corollary to that would be, does synthetic biology would be playing any role in increasing the longevity and the lifespan and health spans?
Synthetic biology is a very broad term, but it usually means that, you're synthesizing new genes or entire genomes. I'm not sure that's going to be the way to go, in the foreseeable future. Because in the foreseeable future, we're not going to, create sort of, transgenic humans, if you like, okay? All sort of major countries have decided that that's not something we are ready to do yet. So I don't think it's going to happen, anytime soon. But you never know in the very distant future.
I think there's a question back there.
Thank you. The session was really informative. It took me back to a decade when I was studying biology. I read this book called Inferior, which talks about research generally is more skewed towards males and less in the female gender. Our longevity study is balanced, or are we seeing a bias in them as well?
Sorry, what was the question?
Inferior is this book written by Angela Saini with the inherent bias towards studies being skewed more towards males than females. How does that hold true in longevity research?
Well, I'm not sure. First of all, I'm not sure I agree with all of the premise of that book. But the other, of course, she would say, well, I'm a male, and I would say that, right? But nevertheless, she interviewed me at a book festival last year in India. So, and we actually get along very well. But I think in longevity studies, the only gender difference is that women tend to live longer. And people don't quite understand what the basis is for, women living longer than men. And there's also some evidence that they live longer, but their period of morbidity is also longer. That means they live more years with health problems at the end. So there are some real, what I would call sex differences.
There's a question there.
Thank you for a very, very good conversation. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I think prophets are crackpots with right PR. And the question is about this connection between longevity and volume that you mentioned. There is, of course, well-known studies about metabolic rate and volume, which exhibits a scaling relation. Is there some kind of a scaling relation here also?
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. So actually, what you pointed out is quite important. The relationship between metabolic rate and longevity is even stronger than the relationship between size and longevity. And the reason they're connected is because smaller animals typically have a higher metabolic rate. And this is because they have a higher surface to volume ratio. And so they have to, maintain, especially if they're mammals, they have to maintain, consume energy to overcome heat loss. And so there are all sorts of reasons why smaller animals have a higher metabolic rate than larger animals. And the relationship between metabolic rate and age is quite strong. Yeah.
There's a question back there. Yeah. Yep, it's you. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Neil. Thank you so much for the session. It was really informative on a topic I don't know much about. My question was related to the phrase that you said, interfering in the aging process. I think that relates more to the lifespan aspect than health span. But has there been, you spoke about the studies done on animals, but has there been credible studies done on humans as well that have shown significant results? And my second question would be more regarding the last part of your discussion, is that does research done on humans, ultimately, do we need to live longer? Thank you.
Sorry.
So the question is, there's plenty of studies done in worms, zebrafish, rodents, even some non-human primates. Is there any credible evidence from studies in humans? And if so, what? And then also, should we be living longer?
Yeah, I think, most of these experiments have not yet been done on humans. That's part of the problem, is that they're still awaiting proper clinical trials. But there's no reason to believe that it'll be different in humans. For example, caloric restriction has worked across a whole range of species, including monkeys. And so, the closer you get to humans, the more likely it is that it's going to also work in humans. And it turns out many of these pathways are highly conserved, from across species. So there's no reason to think it'll be different in humans. Now, it may have a different effect, it may have different side effects. That's why we need clinical trials.
There's a question right
Thank
in
you,
front.
thank you. A very fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. My question is actually adjacent to the science in the following sense, that all aging societies today are suffering because of slowing growth, higher burdens of social security and pensions. It's young people who create GDP and the old people who just live off the, I'm sorry.
Old people who what?
As you have more people enjoying pensions and fewer people paying taxes to support those pensions and health care and so on. So have you considered this angle that...
By the way, I retired last Friday.
So have you considered this angle that societies like Japan and now Germany and aging societies are not going to be able to support increasing fiscal burdens, pension burdens, science research funding, because fewer people are going to be supporting.
So that will be true if longevity keeps increasing. But if longevity doesn't keep increasing and reaches a limit, then what you will have is a sort of society at some equilibrium, of age distribution. So it's not going to be a worsening problem. But it'll nevertheless be a problem, because there are far more old people even today in Korea or Japan that require, a smaller number of working people to support them. So that is a problem. It might be solved partly by automation, partly by engineering like robotics and things like that, which allow old people to live fairly independently without having young people to care for them. So there may be ways, but it is a serious problem. I think all societies are worried. And one of the drivers of aging research, governments are also it's not just billionaires, governments are also putting lots of money into aging research, not to extend life, but to keep old people healthy and independent. And the idea is that they'll keep working longer. So, in the old days, I think retirement age in India used to be in the 50s, which is very low by today's standards. And, in the West now, retirement age is pushing almost 70. And the idea is that, well, if you can be healthy from 70 to 80, maybe you can work until you're 80, instead of 65. So the retirement age of 65 was created when average life expectancy was less than 65. So less than half the people would ever get a pension, And so we've not kept up with that. And so, but to do that, you'd have to keep old people healthy enough that they can work. And, some of it can be done with automation, but, you also have cognitive decline, and you have to do something about that.
There's a question there.
Hello, sir. My name is Devki, and I'm an English major student. Thank you so much for a very, very interesting session. My question to you was, with the falling birth rates and countries being dominated by old people, as you said, do you think humanity will come at a point where governments won't care about ethics in order to keep the population increasing?
Sorry.
The question is, with falling birth rates and shift in demographic, will there come a point when governments will not care about, all the ethical implications of both the old and a desire to drive up birth rate. So what does that do to the...
Well, there are countries which are now, China, for example, has reversed its one-child policy because it's very worried that, it's having all these people are getting old and there are not enough children. So, but even though it has now relaxed the one-child rule, the birth rate is continuing to fall in China. And this is, all societies which are economically well off have this, historical trend of lower birth rate. Whether governments will do something drastic, I'm not sure. If you read Brave New World, again, this is a literature festival, so I highly recommend you read Aldous Huxley's novel. In Brave New World, once you reached a certain age, you were sent off to this death house, and you had a lot of music and good food, and then, you drank something that basically killed you off. So, but none of us wants a society like that, so we'll have to come to some other way of dealing with it.
Question there in the middle.
Hi, I'm Sanjukta. My question is about the longevity market. We're being sold so many supplements, biohacking tools. There was this bizarre thing of like infusing yourself with teenage blood, those kind of things, and stuff like that. So do you believe any of those have sort of meaning, or are they just sort of fancy words to just make you make money? And secondly, do you think AI is going to make a difference to the longevity science?
AI might make a difference in a very general way, in that, it can analyze thousands of genomes and try and, make correlations, recognize patterns that result in higher longevity. But then you'll still have to figure out what those genes are doing, and maybe there'll be hundreds of them, and then, you're not going to be able to necessarily do much with it. But, AI has been surprising in having usefulness in lots of things. As far as all these, supplements and so on, some of them may have a basis in that, as we get older, our ability to make certain biochemicals declines with age. And there's a certain logic that if you take these supplements and you restore the level, then maybe it'll help. But, maybe we make far more than we need. And so there's not been really good randomized clinical trials on any of these supplements to say, okay, this is definitely improving health and improving, longevity. So I just think it's possible, but the evidence still needs to be produced.
Question back there.
Yes, the question is about, we discussed longevity and immortality. Where does affordability come in this? Because all the super drugs we've been talked about, the GLP-1s or inhibitors or anything, they first are available to a privileged class. Even the vaccines race is still lagging. Where do you think this, if at all, it has to happen, and when it has to happen?
Yeah, so that's an extremely important point, and I'm glad you brought that up. It turns out that in Britain, which has a national health service, the difference between the top 10% and the poorest 10%, the richest and the poorest 10%, is 10 years of life expectancy. And in the US, it's 15 years. And if you look at healthy life expectancy, health span, it's even worse than that, okay? So there's a kind of joke in the field that the best way to live a long life is to be rich, okay? And so if we come up with interventions against aging, it's very likely that the first beneficiaries of these interventions will be very rich people. So I think that's a very serious point.
We'll take the last two questions. There's one here, and then we'll take one more there, and it says time up. So 2 questions.
Hi, thank you again for this wonderful session and great moderation of questions too. I'm Dhaval Shah, I'm visiting from Silicon Valley on vacation. My questions are, one is you talked about Abrahamic religions and non-Abrahamic. What is your belief? You believe in reincarnation or not?
Sorry.
And
He wants to know if you believe in reincarnation or not.
Well, I think I think my views are rather well known, so I'm not going to elaborate there. But what I want to say is that my views are sort of irrelevant, okay? Because what you have to do is look at the evidence. You have to look at, the whole point is, it's not about what I say or what, X, Y, or Z says. It's about what is the evidence for various claims. That's how you have to approach it.
We'll take one last question from there and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful session. In terms of interventions that can improve health span, so maybe you mentioned caloric restriction. I'm not sure if that came under lifespan or health span. And I guess another intervention is being rich, I guess. But how does exercise compare? I guess it is an age-old way, an intervention in some sense to improve health span, but in terms of just risk-benefit and compared to other new age things we've been trying out, how does exercise still fare?
Yeah, so in my book, I say that, there are all these supplements and this, that, and the other, and while we're waiting for all this stuff to be actually proved in humans, there are 3 or 4 things we can do ourselves. One of the most important is exercise, okay? And I have to tell you, I was kind of surprised that, my hosts here, who've been very generous, offered me a shuttle from the Trident to come to the NCPA, which is like a 5-minute walk, okay? I mean, literally a 5-minute walk, okay? So exercise is extremely important because it induces regeneration of tissues and regeneration of muscle, maintaining muscle mass as you get older, and also regeneration of even mitochondria in your cells. So exercise is extremely important. The other is, controlling your diet. You don't have to be calorically restricted, but you can have a healthy and very moderate diet. And that's also important. And the third leg to this stool is sleep. Because sleep is when the body recycles and repairs a lot of the damage that occurs during the daily cycle. So these 3 actually help each other. So if you exercise, you'll probably sleep better, and so on. So that's a trio. Then everybody who reaches middle age should get tests for diabetes. By the way, India is one of the diabetes capitals of the world. So I would highly recommend tests for diabetes, test for high cholesterol and high blood pressure, because these are easy to detect and very cheap and easy to treat. And then there are also cancers for which you can get tests early. If detected early, they're much more likely to be easily treatable than if detected late. So there are a number of things you can actually do to improve your health and stay healthy for longer.
Thank you, Venki. We end with the commonsensical advice, and it's been an honor to chat with you.